right, so our speaker for today is Mark Clark, who is an associate professor in the Soil, Water, and Ecosystem Sciences Department at University of Florida. And he hails from up in the Northeast, where he got his BS in marine biology at the University of Massachusetts, and then came down to Florida for master's in wetland ecology and PhD in wetland biogeochemistry, both from University of Florida. Mark works a lot. I believe he's one of his other titles is also an extension specialist in wetlands and water quality. So he works a whole lot with different aspects of nutrient management and impacts on freshwater systems, how to help, urban and ag systems reduce their nutrient impacts. And then also more recently, Mark and I have collaborated a lot on living shorelines and how they can be part of the solution for sea level rise and climate change. Okay, so with that, I'll stop my screen share and hand it over to you, Mark.
All right, thank you very much, Savannah. Let me cue things up here. All right. Yeah, that was a much younger picture of me. I seem to be graying up quite a bit lately, but whatever. All right, so as Savannah mentioned, this is going to be a presentation that is about really this image that's behind me right now. This is the St. Martin's Keys, but this is actually a piece of a bigger study that was conducted relatively recently. And it was a feasibility assessment of special management areas and enhance recreational fisheries and habitat. And this was actually an investigation or a project that was motivated by stakeholders in that area. And I'm only going to talk about one small piece of it. Savannah, I don't know if this report is available online somewhere, but if others are interested in getting into a little more details of the results and the other aspects of pursuing what options might be available to try to address some of the prop scarring impacts that we found, it basically will be available to you. But this is a Florida Sea Grant funded project that we looked into. And so this is going to be just talking about one specific element, which is the status of propeller scarring in the St. Martin's Keys area. All right, so where exactly are we talking about? Some of you probably know this by the back of your hand or even closer, but if you don't know, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, you see the state of Florida, and then that little blue star in there is basically along the Nature Coast. This is kind
Mark,
of the southern...
sorry to interrupt you, but we're just seeing we're not seeing the slides advancing.
Huh. Maybe. Well, that's not gonna work.
Yeah, we're just seeing like there we go. Yep.
How about now? You get the next slide?
Yeah. Yep.
All right. Interesting. I wonder what that was all about. Okay, so the St. Martin's Keys Aquatic, St. Martin's Marsh Aquatic Preserve and St. Martin's Keys. So again, the state of Florida, upper right, the blue star is the location of the St. Martin's Marsh Aquatic Preserve. It's on the southern end of the what's referred to oftentimes as the Nature Coast. It's the area that's outlined in yellow here in the lower left image. You see Crystal River and Homosassa for two nearby coastal communities. And then there's this blue little inset in the south west corner of the St. Martin's Marsh Aquatic Preserve, which is the study area, and that happens to enclose a set of keys referred to as the St. Martin's Keys. And so this is where the footprint of our mapping effort is going to be. These two images don't quite overlap in the sense of the orientation of the St. Martin's Keys on top the blue area, but there's about 22, 23 different keys that are in this area, extremely shallow area, extremely clear water, beautiful area if you ever get a chance to get out there. It's also a very significant area for recreational fishing. A lot of guides use this, and they are a significant part of the stakeholder group that was interested in investigating the impacts or the increased number of prop scars that they were observing out there, and asking some questions about what could be done about it. So some of the challenges associated with actually mapping and identification of prop scars is multifold. Some of you may have actually worked in this area before, but of course, image resolution, if you're going to do any sort of identification and tracing, the higher the resolution, the better. But of course, your assets may limit what you can actually get. So there's, of course, satellites, there's manned aircraft, and then now a proliferation of unmanned or drone sort of platforms that you can use. And so just as an example of how much that resolution makes a difference, the image in the lower right is from Google Earth, which is about a 15 centimeter per pixel resolution. But if we look at a drone image that might have been taken at about, well, 400 foot is the maximum ceiling for drone altitude, unless you get some sort of variance from FAA. But if we look at a drone image superimposed on that, we see that the resolution, and depending on the camera platform you have, could basically go up to 3.25 centimeters. So, you know, a 5x factor of improved resolution. And of course, you see a lot more details. You can actually go in and investigate more clearly what type of prop scar that might be. And you'll see that that came in handy for us later on. So the resolution becomes challenging as to what you have access to. Historically, actually deciding how you're going to trace them, or is they going to be traced individually, or are they going to be aggregated into kind of severe or moderate or non-severe groupings? So you're creating polygons versus actually identifying individual prop scars is a decision or a challenge depending on your resources, again, mostly labor wise. And then of course, if you're actually focused on a relatively small area of known impacts, you might be able to minimize the spatial area. But as we all know, especially in the state of Florida, there's extensive coastlines. So the footprint of the area you might have to be mapping could be very large, thousands, if not tens of thousands of acres or hectares. And so, you know, multiple layers of challenge come into actually implementing a propeller scar mapping sort of program or project. So what we decided to do in this particular project, which had a known footprint of about 2,400 acres, is to use drones, because we really wanted to have that high resolution imagery. We would use a post-processing of that drone imagery using kind of conventional software, and there's lots of web-based platforms that are available, kind of pay-for-service sort of programs. You know, again, the drone is just carrying the camera, but that image needs to then be post-processed through a pretty rigorous effort to ultimately come up with a orthorectified image, which now is something that's, you know, fixing or correcting for all of the image distortion associated with the drone moving around and topography and other things. The next one was with regards to how do we go and interpret all that information, and we chose humans. I'll talk about some alternative approaches in a little bit, but fundamentally we decided on a crowdsourcing approach to actually do the identification and tracing of the prop scars, or geotagging. So we were going to try to tag every individual scar instead of kind of going into some sort of polygon or aggregate areas. And then we take all of that traced information, import it into ArcGIS, and that's where we would actually create the maps and do more spatial analysis of those. So I'm going to step through each one of these pieces of the approach to give you a little bit more background. Essentially, this is the methods. So how did we acquire the images? Well, we used a DJI Matrice 200 drone. It's they call it their Enterprise series, so it's a little bit higher end than most of the drones you might get off the shelf. It has about a 35-minute flight time, which allows it to cover about 110 acres based on the altitude we were flying and the desired overlap of each image. As I mentioned before, 400 foot or about 120 meters up is the ceiling for drone flights. If you want to stay compliant with 107 criteria, you can get waivers higher than that, but we flew at 120 meters. And as the images were collected, there is overlapping of those images, both front and back overlap, as well as a side overlap. So as you're taking the photos, the edges of the photo don't meet. It's basically a 75+% overlap of those images. And the reason for that is the post-processing goes and takes common features in that overlap zone and uses that to stitch together all of this, all of the individual images into a mosaic, or basically a uniform image later on. And I'll touch on that in a second. So that percentage overlap is kind of critical to improve your overall accuracy. We end up with a ground resolution of about 3.25 centimeters per pixel, which is quite good, about 1.3 inches or so. So very, very high resolution. And so what we did is that blue area that I identified before that included the St. Martin's Keys, you see in the lower left here, we broke that into 4 quadrants, and then each quadrant into 6 zones. So we ended up with 24 different zones. Each zone essentially could be covered by one flight of the drone. So each one of those would be basically one, not a single flight, but basically pretty close to a single flight. And if you move to the image to the right, you see this parallel lines, green lines that go back and forth over one of those zones. This is what we refer to as the lawnmower flight pattern, where the drone is basically just going back and forth over that area. The blue rectangle to the right of that, every black dot is where a photograph would have been taken. So we end up with about 550 some odd photos per zone. And each of those photos then is overlapping by at least 75%, but multiple photos will actually overlap in a single area. All of the deployments were off a vessel. So basically water-based sort of deployments, which allows you to obviously get further away from the land. So there's some challenges, of course, with anything you do, but specifically when you're trying to take imagery over water, you have a high probability of glare from the sun. So obviously you need enough sun so that you can get enough light subsurface to illuminate the seagrasses or prop scars or whatever you're looking for. But you don't want so much light, meaning the angle of the sun can't be so high as to create glare. And so we're somewhat restricted to a window of time or day that basically the sun is at least 20 degrees above the horizon, which gives you enough light penetration into the water column, but no greater than about 50 degrees. Because if you go past 50 degrees, now you're going to have glare off the water and then into the image you're trying to take. And you can get away with a higher sun angle sometimes, but only if the water is perfectly flat and calm. And so just these images on the right-hand side give you some illustration of what I'm talking about. The upper right image is optimal. You get a tiny little bit of glare down that bottom left corner, but for the most part, you have good illumination, but no glare that's kind of interrupting your imagery. The middle image shows good light in the water column, but you see this one hot spot, which is the sun. But because there was very little wave energy or wave action or even wavelets there, that sun was focused in a relatively small spot, and that actually can get removed in some of the post-processing. But as the breeze kicks up, you get lots of little wavelets, which then makes irregularities in the water surface, which now means these angles change. So every one of those little wavelets changes those angles in a way that the extent of the glare gets much larger. And so we're into about a quarter of the image, maybe even more, that becomes unusable. And then you have problems actually trying to get rid of that in the post-processing stitching phase. And so there's several, aspects that tend to limit the ability to just go out anytime and take imagery. So the sun glare factor, so time of day, the wavelets or waves, clouds. If you have a perfectly calm day on the water surface, it makes a great mirror of whatever the clouds are overhead. And so if they're puffy clouds, you get this lovely image as if you were pointed up, but instead you're pointed down and getting this glare off the surface. And of course, tides, you're better off at low tide, but if it's extreme low tide, now you can have your seagrasses becoming exposed. You may not physically be able to get to the location, especially if it's very low water. So a lot of issues that have to be juggled to try to get those optimal conditions. Yeah. All right, so let's assume you do a good job in picking that right condition. And you get a good set of imagery. And so now what happens to that imagery? Well, in this case, we're using a commercial product called DroneDeploy. It's a web-based system. There's many others that are out there. Pix4D may be one that some of you are familiar with. But what you do with those images, and we're just going to process through one zone. So basically you have 500 some odd images. And so every one of these little tetrahedrons, I guess, that is like a little pyramid here, is the equivalent of an image. The little ball on top is roughly where the drone would have been, and then that's the image. And so you can see the flight lines, but you see these green and orange rays that are coming down from multiple of those images. Well, what that's doing is identifying a single point in a suite of probably 20 or 30 images that the algorithm determines is the same point based on coordinates and other aspects. And it'll basically start tying all those images together to the point that you now have this long kind of bottom left to upper right image, which is basically the footprint of one of those zones. And this image is now orthorectified, meaning it is kind of spatially correct. And it's also registered in the sense of a latitude, longitude. When you're done with that stitching process, you end up with the imagery in the bottom right, which you don't see any individual photos anymore. They basically blend those lines together. There's a perfect match. You really don't see individual images. And so now you basically went from 550 images back to a single image at a very high resolution. You can also get an output of a quality report, so you have confidence that you've got good overlap and minimal sorts of distortion. So the fact that that is a blue field in that bottom left quality report says that everything was about as good as you could get in that particular image. So now what we have is an orthorectified image that we can do something with. So that orthorectified image is what we then can start to do tracings with, or start looking at the individual prop scars, but moving it around in the sense of electronically is challenging, and you'll see the next step required a little bit of downsizing of that. So one of the aspects of DroneDeploy and why we kind of use that versus some other programs was that we could take that orthorectified image in the upper right and parse it or break it up into tiles. And so you can see that kind of image footprint underneath here. You see a yellow grid work. So each one of those grids is about 3.5 hectare area. And so we can keep track because they can be coded, but now you can clip one of those images out from that orthorectified image that was put together in DroneDeploy, and now take that image and make it available for tracing. And so the export image from DroneDeploy would look like the one in the bottom left. And when we export it out of DroneDeploy, it's in a format and a coordinate system that can be imported into Google Earth Pro. So now we have a platform, Google Earth Pro, that's relatively universal and easily accessible. Many people use it, but we can take that orthorectified image and take out one chunk of that image and then make it available for import to Google Earth. All right, so the next step, of course, is now we have an image that we can move around the landscape, but now we need somebody to look at that image and actually do an identification and actual tracing of the prop scars that are within that image. And so comes the question, well, how do we do that? Well, my question posed there is, what's the best way to identify prop scars in an image? And it's basically train humans, because we're really good at that. We're really good at identifying these patterns, seeing the color contrast and whatnot. And there are efforts underway, and some folks have made some pretty good headway with automation and artificial intelligence, basically learning tools that you can iteratively improve the identification of these, but humans are still better. There's something about the human eye that can identify that. And as you'll see in a little bit, the uncertainties or unexpected things can also pop up. So if you have a highly trained or highly refined kind of artificial or automated process, you might miss other things that the human eye might pick up on and identify. Plus, of course, the crowdsourcing can be scaled up. Logistically, there's issues, but it could be scaled up. But then you run into, well, how do we deal with quality control? How do we make sure the training process is somewhat uniform? How do we know that people are identifying what we're calling a prop scar so that everybody's seeing the same extent? And so that was another big part of this project, was to actually develop that process. So how do we train the crowd, so to speak? And so first off, we had a limited entry. Our crowd was not a big crowd. It was a limited entry, meaning we identified people we thought would participate or could participate. The maximum we had was 12 folks that were in our crowd. So this, in theory, could be scaled much bigger, but of course now you enter into all sorts of other challenges. But even though there were only 12, we developed, and I say we, and I failed to, because we were interrupting or I was trying to get the slides to go forward. Two other individuals played a huge role in this part of the project. One was Savannah Berry, who's already introduced herself earlier. But basically, we developed a training video that any person in the crowd would have to watch and basically be trained to look for the various patterns in the process. We had a step-by-step protocol that they would work through in the process of taking that or importing that tile from or basically that tile into Google Earth Pro, and then how to go about doing the tracing because they were color coded, and then how to save the file after the individual tracing occurred and export it as a KML file that could then be imported into GIS. And so there were a process of that training, but then there was also a kind of a quality control mechanism we built into this, where there were 3 training tiles, meaning they were 3 of those same sort of cutouts from an existing or an actual image from the St. Martin's Keys area that the prospective tracer or geotagger would go and delineate, identify, and trace, and their results would be compared to a reference set, which consisted of 3 professionals, if we want to, I'm putting big quotes up, but basically a reference set of that same tile that had been traced by other folks. And so this was how we would go and kind of determine, had they reached a threshold of proficiency that would match what might be this reference set. And so there was a comparison, in this bottom right image provides that comparison. So on the left-hand side would be the potential crowd participant or geotagger. The right is the image that was kind of the reference image. The images or the lines in the middle is basically the 2 sets of those lines overlapping. And then an actual statistical comparison was made between the 2. And if they achieved a 95% efficiency, they were basically given the thumbs up and allowed to go forward with actual tracing of other tiles. If, however, failure is not the right word, were unable to meet the level of proficiency after 3 tries, they basically were let go because basically there was something, for whatever reason, we didn't feel that they could achieve a level of competence. That said, nobody got kicked out. So everybody, all of the 12 that we had selected were indeed able to meet that proficiency. But that's how we established a QA/QC component. So what exactly were we looking for in these images? So the traditional prop scar that you think about is what we refer to as light scars. Now, light doesn't mean light as in non-impacting. Light meant color-wise, there was a lighter contrast of the spectral signature in the prop scar relative to the adjacent signature. And so this is where a high likelihood that the prop actually went down through the seagrass bed, through the roots, and exposed mineral bottom material. And so here's some pretty good examples. Everybody pretty much is kind of aware of this negative impact. However, we also found a couple of other things that we asked the geotaggers to look at, and one included what we call dark scars. And this is one where it sure looks like a prop scar, but it does not seem to be as impactful, meaning as deep. Sometimes we refer to it as a haircut, but definitely some sort of level of contact was occurring between a propeller scar and the top of the seagrass. At least these could be younger scars, they could be recovering scars. It's uncertain exactly the mechanisms, but they were quite prominent also in our survey. And so you can clearly see these dark features that are running across this seagrass bed. We also found what we called hard bottom scars. And so this area in the St. Martin's Keys has kind of a mosaic of seagrass beds, but also interspersed are limestone hard bottom, which are oftentimes colonized by algal communities and sponges and things. And so there were definitely these very clear linear features across a lot of those. So this reddish area in the left-hand image is basically algae that is attached to the hard bottom community, but you see these lighter streaks that run through it. And if you kind of follow that same trace, you see it runs across the seagrass as a dark scar and then continues. And the one on the left-hand side is going through the side. Now, I don't necessarily think that the prop was actually hitting the bottom here, but the prop wash was likely dislodging vegetation. And that's probably what we're seeing as a that kind of spectral signature coming through. And of course, the bottom right is pretty clearly an arcing feature there. And then last but not least, there was one other type of, and I use scar loosely in this, there was definitely a visual signature of a very wide spectral difference that, and I say wide in here, meaning 6 to 8 feet wide. And so we believe those are airboat scars, quote unquote. And so we didn't see a whole lot of these, but it definitely was apparent. You see 2 of them here parallel to each other, almost like a check mark in reverse running through here. So these are 4 different types of scars that we were looking for as we went through these images that the crowd was evaluating. Okay, so basically the process here relatively straightforward once we get to the individual tile. So there was a tile that was made available to the geotagger. The geotagger would bring it into Google Earth Pro, and then they would select the tool. It's called a polyline, where they would then trace the various scars and color code them according to those 4 different types. And you see the middle image here where we've got white, which would be the light scars, green, which would be the dark scars, orange, which would be the hard bottom scores. And in this case, there's no airboat, but they would be yellow coded if that had occurred. And then once they're done tracing all of the scars that they can identify in that tile, they would export that polyline or the polylines that they had identified out as a KML file. So now each of these individual lines are independent units. So whatever we do with them now, it's identifying each individual prop scar. So it's not an aggregate of prop scars. It's not prop scars by tile. It's basically individual prop scars with a latitude, longitude coordinate system that can be now looked at in a geospatial sense. So what did we do with that information? Well, that information was then imported into ArcGIS, converted over to a line feature. And then we could go and we stitched it all back together again. So now we're looking at the prop scars at the scale again of the mapped area, which is now 2,400 acres, which can then be superimposed over things like the actual keys, or we don't have any really good topography out there, which would be great, or we don't have any vegetative community types, which would also be great. But fundamentally now we have a layer, and actually 4 layers, one for each prop scar type, that we can then start to look at for geospatial analysis. And so the image you see here are those prop scars now superimposed on a larger image of that mapped area around the St. Martin's Keys. And you can see there's quite a few of them. And this is at a pretty large scale. If we zoomed in, we could probably pick up a couple more in there. So if we go and analyze this, we see that there were, and the term impact is relative to the occurrence more than the actual damage, because that's something that we don't really know what sort of actual damage is occurring from dark or hard bottom or airboat scars. Light scars do have some analyses that have occurred for restoration costs and things like that. So when I say impact, I really mean occurrence. But what we see here is a total length of light scarring of about 256,000 linear feet across that whole area. Dark scars about, let's just call it 90,000 feet. Hard bottom about 20,000. And then airboats, you see quite small. We didn't find a whole lot of airboat. quote unquote impacts. But if we multiply by the average width, so we were able to zoom in close enough to actually get some average widths of the different types of prop scars, and so multiply to actually turn that linear foot into area, and we see the actual footprint of impact that's occurring from light scars, dark and hard bottom in the area. All right, so because we can also look at this in different ways, which is really not a feature we could have used or done if these were kind of aggregates as just severe or non-severe, we started to look at the occurrence in different ways as well. And so one of them was to basically take the whole area and overlay what's called a fishnet, which is a 1 acre grid, and then ask how many scars were within each grid. So these are actually linear feet of scars per acre. And the color coding indicates if there's no color overlaid on the actual image, then it basically didn't have any scarring in it. But you see these different classes from the lightest tan up to 500 linear feet per acre. And then in the darkest, which is only up in the northern end around key 1 and key 2, could have anywhere between 2,500 and up to 3,000 linear feet per acre. So the distribution of prop scarring is not equal throughout this area. It's definitely concentrated in certain areas, and in this case you're seeing it mostly in that northern part. Now this is all scar types. Now if we break this out into the 3 prominent ones, we didn't do the airboat scarring, but you see the light scars on the left hand side are essentially a mirror image of the previous slide, but the dark scars also are very concentrated up in that north area of the mapping zone. And then the hard bottom is a little more dispersed. We've got a higher concentration kind of in the midsection there, and this has a lot to do with where the hard bottom communities were or are in that landscape. And so just as some idea here about the spatial distribution and where the highest densities of those scars are occurring. We also started to ask the question, well, how much is this scarring associated with the keys out there? And so we did an analysis where we created different concentric buffer zones around each of the keys, and then clipped that out and looked at the scars within those different zones. And so the left-hand image is just a color coding of the different concentric buffer zones. And then in the right-hand side, the A is basically that would be a 100-foot zone. The B, the upper right image, is the 200-foot, 300, and then I think the bottom right is actually a 600-foot buffer zone. But you get the idea now with regards to the, how we started to look at the number or linear length of the prop scars just within these proximities of the individual keys. And if we plot that out or start looking at that in a kind of a spatial distribution sense, we can see this plot. Basically, the left-hand side is the scar density in the sense of the square feet per acre. So this is kind of an area per area. Each of the colors represents a different key or the concentric ring around each of those individual keys. And across the x-axis on the bottom is the buffer zone. So these are concentric, they're not aggregate, they don't add up. So basically, this first point on the blue line would be basically the number of scars that occurred within the 100-foot, from 0 to 100 feet out buffer zone. This point here would be the number of scars that occurred between 100 feet out and 200 feet out. So these are like donuts that keep getting larger around the keys. And you can see that 2 of these keys have a disproportionate level of scar density than the majority of the other keys, even though they're not all flat on the bottom down here in the sense of not having any impacts, but there is kind of a disproportionate distribution of that scar density around keys 1 and 2. But as you right next to the key, it's high, but not as high as when you get off to that 100 to 200 foot buffer, and then the 200 to 300 foot buffer starts to drop off again. So there's kind of a density, at least from the standpoint of area per area, where those prop scars are concentrated around the keys. And some of that has to probably do with the depth. Things would obviously be shallowing up, but also the draw of near shore fishing around those keys, especially when it's maybe higher tide or where there's some vegetative cover that might be targeted. As you follow that one blue line or the key one, you see by the time you get out to somewhere 800, maybe even 900 foot buffer zone, like that far away from the key, you start to drop back into what you might think is kind of a background sort of layer. But this gives a strong idea of the concentration of the scarring around the keys and around some keys in particular. So either way, so here's just using 600 foot as the buffer around a set of those keys, and then a tabulation of the percent scarring for each of those keys within that 600 foot buffer. And you could, of course, parse that any way you want in the sense of 400, 600,000 foot, whatever you want it to be. And the beauty of this is the way these scars were mapped, they are individual. And so we can aggregate that way. But what we see is that this is just for light scarring, but within the 600 foot buffer, about 70% of the total area that's being scarred is basically within this footprint. So 70% of the scarring is occurring within 600 feet of the keys. And then, of course, these two in the upper, the northern side have a disproportionate number of those. They're basically accounting for probably, about 30%, 40% overall. All right, so just to wrap things up here, I've got two conclusion slides. One is kind of process related, one is impact related. But with regards to the use of drones or UAS mapping of propeller scars, the real pro is the very high resolution. I mean, it's pretty remarkable what you can get out of these images. The cons, of course, are that you do have to deal with the sun angle, tides, weather constraints, other factors that don't always converge nicely to get the job done when you want it to get done. But you can pick that time of year when it's optimal or likely to be more optimal and pretty much get things in pretty good shape. The crowdsourcing approach to our tracing of propeller scars went very well. Again, we had a limited crowd, so it wasn't a mob, it was a crowd, small crowd. But of course, it was accurate. They accommodated some spectral variability, which is inherent to a lot of the imagery that's produced. And they can, I'm saying here, quote unquote, see unexpected features. If you trained a program to only look for a particular feature and it was automated, it wouldn't see anything else. Whereas, we had some feedback options for the tracers to identify and report things that they may have seen that weren't necessarily just automated. The problem or the con is, of course, it's time consuming. You have to manage the crowd. And then there's a lot of this tile data management. If it was just all in a GIS format and process there, it'd be one thing, but there was a lot of pieces moving around. It all worked, but it does take a little bit more effort. From the mapping side, using or being able to trace individual prop scars versus kind of having aggregate areas of dense or severe. I tell you that the individual prop scarring identification is quite compelling visually. When shared with the stakeholders, they were made quite quickly aware of the levels of impact. Individual scar identification allows for a greater range of analysis. So the fact that we can now take that, import it into GIS and actually look at it in a whole different way than if there were polygons is very, very helpful and useful. And then this orthorectified imagery, which is a very high end resolution on the front end, can actually be used as a base map for future images. And so you can, what's called register, basically match that image, this image, to future images. And so you can now see time or change over time, whereas polygons don't allow you to do that quite as effectively. We can literally trace a single prop scar this way. With regards to impact conclusions based on the findings here, very significant impacts of light scarring within the mapped area. If you convert the feet to miles, you get about 48.6 miles of prop scars that have occurred out there, which count up to about 7 acres. We did not expect to see, or at least originally not had intended to see, these dark scars or hard bottom scarring. And so that's a new feature of potential concern. We don't really know what the implications of it are, but should be and get investigated probably. Roughly 70% of the scarring is concentrated within 600 feet of the keys. And of course, the majority of that is disproportionately loaded up on those keys to the north. And the last slide, a big thank you to the crowd. And the crowd is both the crowd that helped us do the tracing, the geotagging, but also the crowd that's on listening to me right now. And with that, I will take questions. My email is down the bottom if anybody wants to have a look at that or contact me for more details. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. I mean, I think it worked out just based on your and Chris's schedules. But last month, we had Chris talking about the overall like habitat mapping. And so it's cool to see like this different version zoomed in. You do have one question in the chat. I can read it to you if you want. And then other folks, if you want to unmute or if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat.
Is this Jamie?
Yeah, the first one is what's the probability that dark scars are actually light scars that have filled in with rack or other drift material?
Yeah, Jamie, it's a good question. We didn't really explore what the I guess I'll call it composition was. They were definitely clearly scars that had things like drift algae that would accumulate in them, and therefore they might have looked more like dark scars, and we didn't really look into detail, but that's a total possibility. I don't think that's the prevailing dark scar. I really think that something about just literally like a haircut going on causes that. And maybe it's just a disturbance of the epiphyte load or something like that is, damaged. But I don't think that the predominance of the dark scars are a result of drift algae ending up in a light scar trench. So that doesn't mean it couldn't occur, but I don't think so.
So Trisha has another question. Do you have time, funding, and or desire to repeat this effort in Deadman Bay of Steenhatchee? The scarring there is similar.
The desire is always there. The time is not, and the funding is not at present. So if you can help with those other items, Trisha, I'd be happy to help.
Well, maybe we'll get together in the future and talk about that.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I spent 2.5 years down in the Florida Keys, and I did not really know anything about St. Martin's Keys. And when Savannah mentioned this project, I was intrigued from the drone perspective, but ever since I've been there, all I want to do is go back. So yeah, let's talk.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to say we have many of the crowd tracers here in the Zoom room, and Laura was our third expert.
Yeah.
So a lot of us were tracing lines.
Yeah, and I don't think Lauren's on, but I think the responsibility of the crowd was not necessarily equally distributed. There were certain individuals that really took on an outsized role. But yes, the crowd, the concept of the crowd worked. I think it would be harder to manage at larger scales, but I don't think it's impossible. I think it also, like all citizen science opportunities, you gain awareness just in the participation process too. And so, I think if something like this was to happen again, I think that now that we have a methodology, I think we could probably find a better way to broaden that reach and participation. So.
Okay, so another one from Alex. What do you think about the ecological implications of the scarring occurring near the Keys? Do you think it's better that the scars tend to be spatially concentrated, with better in quotes?
Hey, Alex. Yeah, no scarring's good. Better, I don't know. I don't know if it's better to think of sacrificing certain areas. I really don't think so. I think that and this actually is something that has come up as a discussion point about possible management, meaning, let's just say that there was a restricted zone that was placed around those two northern keys, but not a universal restricted zone. So all of a sudden, whoever was using those northern keys that may have been generating impacts now would just change course and go after a different key, and therefore those impacts would just shift. So probably whatever management action is taken should be more uniformly applied to all keys so that you don't get that shifting. And the counter to that, I wouldn't say, well, let's just sacrifice those keys, because I think it won't take much longer to really destroy even more habitat there if it's concentrated there. But interestingly, when we had a meeting with the stakeholders, we were moving along the lines of the thinking that some sort of buffer zones that would restrict active motoring in those areas and move to kind of pole and troll just within some proximity to minimize the impacts would be more, I guess, appealing or seemingly more desirable. And yet the response we got from that first engagement that I had, at least with stakeholders, was they were more interested in literally saying the whole area should be under kind of a no active motor zone, except for certain passageways. So you kind of establish these highways, not the word, but transit ways through this area, and let that be the only places or the primary places for transit of motoring. And then everything else by default becomes pole and troll. And so instead of saying, okay, well, we're going to identify where these impacts are quote unquote acceptable, no, we're going to basically say, we're going to assume they're not acceptable really anywhere, and try to allow that transit to occur, because that's kind of a safety factor as much as anything, but to minimize the impact. So yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, Alex. I mean, I think you'd have to actually study that to see if that was better to, really damage certain areas and relieve others, or I like the way the actual stakeholders were coming at this, which was a much more blanket minimization of any impacts. So.
And sort of a related question is, why was the scarring concentrated around these two particular keys?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. My guess again is that whatever activity draws the boat near is what's causing the damage, and I'm assuming it's fishing. And fishing closer to shore, and or the fact that it's just shallower closer to shore, increases the likelihood that impacts are going to occur. And we don't really have a really good bathymetry map of there. It could be that those two keys have shallower depths around the edges of those keys relative to the other ones, but I don't think so. I don't know that for sure, but I think obviously it's probably fishing that draws them in, but whether or not there's also a compounding factor of bathymetry in that area, I'm not sure. So Dan, I don't know if you got any insight on that.
Anecdotally, we are told that those are the best snook islands, that those islands hold snook the most, and they also happen to be the farthest northwest, which would mean if you were fishing out of Crystal River, which the highest concentration of boat trips in this area are from the north rather than from the south, those would also be the first keys that you would come upon. So that's what the guides thought. But of course, like you said, we don't actually have hard data on that.
Yeah, but it's definitely disproportionately loaded up there.
All right. Well, the questions seem to be slowing down somewhat. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We do have another program next month, so I'll send out a follow-up to everyone who is registered for this with the link to the recording of this program, and also a link to register for next month's program. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And I don't know, Mark, if you have any parting thoughts, but we appreciate your time as well.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thanks everybody for having a watch. Feel free to reach out. But again, thanks, and don't let what you see happening in these photos happen to you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.